Hello there, Lunar Squadron, and welcome back to the channel. It is safe to say that it was a rather rough week when it comes to the gaming industry, especially Star Wars gaming, as we have gone through yet another round of layoffs at a massive gaming studio, and unfortunately, lives were impacted and Star Wars gaming was directly impacted as the upcoming Star Wars FPS title Out of Respawn has been officially canceled. However, the news is not all doom and gloom this week, as we did get a pretty positive and exciting news update for the Star Wars Battlefront Classic Collection that we hope points to a much brighter future for Star Wars gaming, and we're going to break down everything that we're talking about. But first, if you're new to the channel, we would love to have you, and the way to do that, just go down below this video, hit that little subscribe button, the bell notification right on next to it. It will notify you every single time that Andreas and I upload. Now with that out of the way, Andreas, you ready to talk about a very up and down week when it comes to Star Wars?
Yep, let's do it, guys. Just like you said, Nick, this has been a super bittersweet week for Star Wars gaming, so why don't we just start off with the positive here. I think everybody could use a little bit of positive in their life at this point. So the big positive headline for Star Wars this week being that Star Wars Classic Collection has been bodying new AAA games on the PlayStation 5 pre-order best-selling list, which is incredibly impressive. And not only that, but earlier on this week, Battlefront Classic Collection was, I think, 5th place in the United States rankings, but it's actually picked up momentum since the release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now it's situated in 2nd place, notably in front of some big SIE titles like MLB The Show 24, Rise of the Ronin, and Stellar Blade. These are titles that you would expect Sony to be pushing for pre-orders, and yet these two games from the PlayStation 2 era are just taking over the dialogue on PS5 pre-orders. Nick, not only is this trend super impressive for these two games, I think it's also kind of necessary news in a week that was otherwise a bit sour for Star Wars gaming.
Yeah, definitely. It has really been a very disappointing week with all of the layoffs hitting Respawn, and like I said, people's livelihoods being directly impacted in a really bad way, and then losing the Star Wars FPS title that we were all very excited about. It was just such a rough week. And to hear that the Star Wars Battlefront Classic Collection is doing so well in the pre-orders for PlayStation, I think is a really big deal for a multitude of reasons. And yes, of course, there are caveats that go alongside it. It's not going up against any massive heavy hitter upcoming games like a God of War, or like a new Call of Duty or something like that. But it is beating some pretty impressive titles. You mentioned MLB The Show. That is one of Sony's best-selling franchises each year. Rise of the Ronin people are really excited about. Stellar Blade, I've heard people are really excited about. Like, these are not no-name titles that this is going up against, and it was right there with Final Fantasy earlier this week before that game came out. So like, Battlefront is doing very impressive on the pre-order front, and why I think this is such a big deal is because this game is a 20-year-old port. This is not a brand new Star Wars game in a sense, and it is doing this well. And why I think this is also a big deal is because, you know, when EA canceled the Star Wars FPS title, it really felt like what they were trying to say is that we don't believe in the long-term viability of this franchise. Like, we are going away from these franchises and licensing IP, and we're going to start going towards owned IP. And whether that is, you know, because they don't want to pay the licensing fees and maybe that's too high, but I really feel like they don't believe in Star Wars as a franchise. It's honestly never felt like EA fully invested in the potential of Star Wars once they got that exclusivity contract. Like, yes, we got the 2 Star Wars Battlefront games, we got Squadrons and the Jedi franchise, but it kind of felt like the bare minimum the whole time. It never felt like they took advantage of the exclusivity that they had for such a massive franchise. And to hear EA talk about how, like, well, we don't really know if this franchise is long-term viable, and like, we don't know if Star Wars will do well for us. What our fans really want are these open world live service type games. We don't think the Star Wars FPS is really going to perform well. And then you have this 20-year-old port that is doing so well for itself on the pre-order side of things. It's really exciting because it feels like it's not about the ends when it comes to this, it's about the means. It's not about the fact that it is a Star Wars title. It's about what kind of Star Wars titles you are releasing. And when you give the fans very exciting titles and the games that they want, they will show up for it. So it kind of completely dispels this conversation about, man, Star Wars is kind of a dying IP in the gaming side of things. It's just not really worth it anymore. It is worth it because when you give the fans what they want, such as Battlefront, it is going to do well. So what I'm hoping for that comes out of this when it comes to the Classic Collection is, yeah, it's not going to sell millions and millions and millions of titles like it could, but I don't think it's going to. But what I'm hoping is that Lucasfilm and Disney see the success of the Classic Collection and they realize, hey, this is a 20-year-old port, and look how well it did for itself relative. Maybe we need to get more serious about the gaming side of things when it comes to Star Wars, and then they'll start looking for more developers to start making these Star Wars titles that people want. Because after Outlaws comes out later this year, and this Classic Collection comes out, it's going to be a few years before we get a next big Star Wars game. Like, yes, EA is continuing the Jedi franchise and we'll be getting Jedi 3. That was confirmed and that's exciting. But that's probably a few years down the road. And it sounds like once that game is released, they're kind of done with Star Wars. And then Bit Reactor's Star Wars game might still be out there. It might not. No one's really sure at the moment. But outside of that, there's not any really big Star Wars games coming out. I guess you could say Eclipse, but God knows what's going to happen with that. And we were supposed to be entering this next golden era of Star Wars gaming. And it doesn't really feel like that's going to happen. So what I'm really hoping for is that this game sells incredibly well. It seems like it's going to. This was a huge update when it comes to the pre-orders to see how well it's doing. And I hope it just kind of kicks things off with Lucasfilm and Disney and kind of just gets them into gear and helps realize that we need to be investing in Star Wars gaming moving forward.
I definitely hope that the success of this Battlefront Classic Collection does make waves and that it sends a message to all sorts of studios that the Star Wars brand is still a strong one and that it's worth making games in connection with. And in that regard, I think my hopes for a future Battlefront, a new AAA Battlefront, have kind of evolved over the last week since this Electronic Arts announcement. And I think last week I was hoping that the success of the Classic Collection would send a message to EA to make the next Battlefront. I was hoping maybe they would have Respawn chime in on that project, because we all know that DICE was moving on from Battlefront and going towards Battlefield and working on its own IP. But I was really hoping that in the future we could maybe see a team of the talent level of Respawn working with a brand that we love like Battlefront. And now, after this latest announcement from the CEO of EA saying, and I think the quote that everybody's talking about has been this one, saying, "We are also sunsetting games and moving away from development of future licensed IP that we do not believe will be successful in our changing industry." EA's CEO Andrew Wilson went on to say, "This greater focus allows us to drive creativity, accelerate innovation, and double down on our biggest opportunities, including our owned IP, sports, and massive online communities." Nick, just reading what EA is planning on doubling down on here, massive online communities, it almost seems like a no-brainer that they would want to maybe evolve away from a first-person shooter that they had already been planning on and maybe shifting gears towards a Battlefront with Respawn. But it seems like, if we're reading the room here, that Respawn, EA in general, are almost divorcing from the Star Wars property after Jedi 3 is released. And that's something that I think is really upsetting, particularly as a person who thought that EA would be having more incredible titles in the Star Wars universe. And also, as a Star Wars fan, I think the cancellation of this FPS game really does trigger almost like a PTSD reaction from this fan base. You can almost list a laundry list of different Star Wars games that have been canceled. Most recently, Project Ragtag canceled out of, you guessed it, EA when they closed down Visceral Games. I think that also was in the context of an IP like Star Wars that has had a history of further cancellations, including, but not limited to, Star Wars 1313, Knights of the Old Republic 3, the original Battlefront 3, Force Unleashed 3, Jedi Knight 3, Dark Squadron, Imperial Commando, which was supposed to be a successor to Republic Commando. There have been cancellations after cancellations after cancellations with this IP, and so I think this is just troubling and upsetting for this community that yet another game has been added to that list. And we're looking to games like Battlefront Classic Collection, games like Star Wars Outlaws going forward to prove a broader point here that Star Wars can be successful in a gaming format in a big way that makes waves, that makes companies regret the decision of dropping this IP moving forward. I almost have more of a drive in watching these projects like Classic Collection, like Star Wars Outlaws. I really hope that these projects do succeed in the best way, because as a Star Wars fan, I think we should really be rallying around these titles right now. Nick, one final question for you to close out this discussion. Are you feeling optimistic for Star Wars in the future, or are you feeling more worried for Star Wars gaming in the future?
I can't say I'm optimistic going forward. Like, I was a lot more optimistic when Lucasfilm Games was revealed, like the company itself, the subsidiary of Lucasfilm was revealed. That was probably the most optimistic I've been in the last 10 years. And I feel like since then, that optimism has just taken hits. But I don't want to say I'm pessimistic about the future, but I am worried about it just because after Outlaws comes out later this year in Classic Collection in a few weeks, there really isn't much on the horizon here for Star Wars, at least stuff that has been announced. And that is concerning for me. And it kind of feels like that is just the MO for Star Wars right now with like the way the films are going. And there's not a whole lot of projects in the works with the TV side of things. It just feels like Star Wars has such a hard time getting off the ground, and it's starting to hurt the gaming side of it. So I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I'm not as optimistic as I was a few years ago. But I will say, last thing, what does make me feel good is how well this Classic Collection is performing early on. Like, the early returns on this make me really excited, and I'm hoping, like I said, that just like gets drilled into the heads of the people at Lucasfilm and Disney and realize that like you got to keep going with this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just looking at what we have coming up, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. Obviously, this has been a hard week for everyone, particularly for those who are affected at Respawn, but I do think there is hope going forward. Even looking at things like the Embracer Group selling Saber Interactive, it looks like Saber may have just saved the KOTOR remake, and in leaving the Embracer Group, maybe that project will find success. We have Star Wars Outlaws, we've got the Classic Collection, we've got Skydance New Media's project, which is helmed by Amy Hennig, who was in charge of Project Ragtag. Of course, also Dominic Robillard, the director behind Star Wars 1313, involved in that project as well. So that also feels like this revenge tour of a Star Wars project, but I think there's at least glimpses going forward. But one thing's for sure, I really hope this Classic Collection galvanizes Star Wars in games going forward. That said, let us know in the comments down below how you all feel about Star Wars gaming right now. Is it all doom and gloom following this EA announcement, or is there hope going forward? I'd love to hear what all of you have to say in the comments. That said, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, we will see you all next time.